Awesome. Let's do it, CT. You're up.
All right. Welcome back. Cutoffs and Coffee. Appreciate y'all swinging in, listening to us today. Our guest today, Korey Van Wyk, man. Really excited to have this guy on. He's the community manager for Art of Coaching. He's a former strength and conditioning coach as well as professor at Northwestern College in Iowa. He's a soon-to-be father by the time you hear this. He will be the father of a lovely young girl. He will tell you he is a superhero nerd. And James, let me tell you, before I was ever the arm guy, Korey was the arm guy when we met in 2012. Korey, thanks for coming on with us, man. How you doing?
Oh man, thank you guys so much for having me. So quick short story about the name of the like your guys' podcast. So yeah. Colin, do you remember? So Colin and I were personal trainers, group fitness instructors back in the day together. And do you remember Fashion Tank Fridays?
Yes, I could never forget that. Yeah.
So
James, that sounds like something we were doing.
The name of the podcast with the Cutoffs reminded me of those days, and I'll never forget my very first Friday at the gym, and I didn't have a tank top on, and I walk in, and Joe, our boss, looks at me and goes, "Hey man, you need a tank top." I'm like, yeah, okay. And he dead serious looks at me. No. You need a tank top. Go change. And I'm like, I don't have a tank top. And so he's like, all right, I got one for you. So literally made me change before our first group into a tank top. Fashion Tank Fridays. Oh yeah. So good times.
So funny. Yeah, I remember that. Well, Korey and I started in group fitness together in 2012 in Des Moines, Iowa. Worked at an awesome gym. Yeah, and he's talking about I would usually be in tank tops, and he would be, being the superhero nerd himself, he would be in a superhero Under Armour tight tank top. And that's, I always kind of saw that, and I thought, or not a tank top, excuse me, an Under Armour tight tee. And I was always so impressed with his arms and his shoulders. And so that's why I said, man, before CT was ever the arm guy, Korey was. So what were you doing, Korey, before your time at Elite Edge in 2012? And then what have you been doing since, just so for people who don't know about you?
Yeah. So just very quick, I guess, background on me. I'm a classically trained strength coach. Got really lucky in my education early on because my undergraduate school, Central College in Pella, Iowa, actually, while I was there, developed a strength and conditioning major. So I luckily graduated with the strength and conditioning major from Central, and then went on to Nebraska, the University of Nebraska, to get my master's in nutrition. And so that's kind of what I was doing before. And actually right before Elite, I came to Elite after actually leaving my doctorate at Iowa State University. And so I didn't finish it. And we can get maybe into that kind of the career lesson I learned there. But I was getting my doctorate in nutrition at Iowa State and just realized it was not the thing for me. And that's what brought me to Elite and got me kind of back into strength and conditioning, got me back into working with people, being on the floor for hours on end, and dealing with kind of the somewhat times the chaos that would go on. And, even session to session, even though like, Colin, we would have the workout each day was the same, group to group, but each individual class was so different. You'd go from the 5 a.m. class that's got people strolling in, they're tired, they don't want to be there right away, but they know it's good for them. And we're trying to wake them up or get them going. And then 6 a.m. class is always the big class because it's everyone's doing it before work. And then like by 8 a.m., 9 a.m., it dwindles down to maybe like 5 to 10 people. Totally different dynamic. And you've got to be almost a different type of coach. So that just kind of reignited I knew about myself that I had to work with people and be coaching people day to day if I was going to be happy. And that led me to where I was at previous to Art of Coaching. For 6 years, I was a strength and conditioning coach and professor at Northwestern College in Orange City, Iowa, where I currently am. And I just, my caveat a little bit with professor, like I said, I do not have my doctorate. I was actually a professor of practice, which is a specific rank of professor that part of your job dictates that you actually practice in your field. So luckily, my practice was as a strength and conditioning coach for 6 of our teams: football, wrestling, men's and women's soccer, cheer, and dance. And that's how I kind of fulfilled that kind of branch of my job.
Man.
And yeah, then I was that until this past May, I was doing that until I joined on with Art of Coaching.
So how's the art coaching kind of shift been? How has that been going? You mentioned earlier that's, mostly online. Have you seen a lot of difference in your schedule, I'm sure, day to day with that?
Very different schedule. I would say the hours are similar. Like the hours are similar. Everything's just shifted. So yeah, I do not have to be in the facility every day by 5 a.m. anymore. Like I don't have to, I don't have that aspect of my job, but total number of hours, it's about the same. But yeah, I'm working, as you guys can see, I'm at home, I'm working from home. And what's been interesting about it, well, the transition was smoothed out because due to COVID, I had to teach all of my classes online for the last 6 weeks. And I was forced to move home and set up my home office. So that's helped. But like I said earlier, I found out at Elite that I was meant to work with people. And now all of a sudden my job is completely online. And actually, our world's just changed so much that now, even if you're at home, you're still doing stuff like this virtually. And I get to work with some amazing colleagues within Art of Coaching that I still get to talk to every single day virtually via WhatsApp, voice memos, Marco Polo. There's so many ways that you can still get that human interaction. That's helped a ton, even for someone like me who does like that human interaction. And we might get into this later, but we do offer online training programs through Train Heroic, and I'm interacting with people on there and coaching them through our programs. So there's still a lot of that. And what has been, it feels almost like I'm transitioning into Northwestern again, where you're like, I was like a first year professor and strength coach, and I'm given 6 teams and 4 classes in July. And I've got to have them ready by August. And I'm just like, what? Like, I don't know. I've never taught a class before. I don't even know what I'm doing. I'm just going to try the best I can. And there's some similar elements there where, yeah, my job is 100% digital, and I'm trying to learn what I need to do in my job and do things I've never done before while trying to help a company grow and run more efficiently. So there's a massive learning curve from that standpoint as well.
Yeah, and it's definitely like eye-opening to see probably how many people you're able to reach without being directly in contact with them, through that new job, with the Art of Coaching. As a practicing strength coach, when you were on site or when you were starting out with CT, kind of along your journey, was there any point where you kind of took a step back and looked at what you were doing and maybe had a paradigm shift of what you were coaching and how you were coaching that made you either shift gears and coach a different way, or maybe include different exercises? How has that kind of played out through your career?
Oh man, yeah, lots of different moments that come to mind. From a how to coach standpoint, I would say, to really put it briefly, my first year at Northwestern taught me a lot about stepping into a new environment and a new culture, and how even if you think you know what you're stepping into, because my sister actually went to Northwestern. Northwestern and where I went to school are very similar in the type of town, even the type of families that might send their kids there. The sports programs I was walking into, similar like histories of success. Like both of the coaches, like the classic football coaches of our respective institutions, well, Central's is in the College Football Hall of Fame, and Northwestern's is on the ballot right now currently. And I'm thinking, I know this place I'm stepping into. And you know what? I just didn't. And, without going into too much detail, there were multiple wake-up calls that made me shift how I coached and how I really maybe handled myself. And I needed to increase the awareness of how I was coming across as a coach and be empathetic to the fact that none of these athletes knew me. And there was a little resistance there, and it was no one's fault but my own, because I wasn't clear enough with my expectations. And I also didn't spend enough time really trying to understand where I was stepping into. So that just, first of all, made me reevaluate how I related to athletes, and we can maybe get into that a little bit later. And first and foremost, caused me to be way more self-aware of the presence I was conveying and how I was carrying myself on the floor. And I think that what ultimately that led me to be was a coach that was more approachable, a coach that athletes felt like they could come to if they ever had any issues on the floor or otherwise. And what that does down the road is allows you to be a coach that, when needed, can push the athlete harder, right? Like, yes, you can, like any coach in this very short term, that kind of get this short-term increase in effort. But if that's a strategy, like that's used day in, day out, session after session, that's going to wear on an athlete quite a bit. Versus if an athlete feels comfortable with you from the standpoint that they know that you're in their corner, and then the times you got to push them a little bit more, they're going to be more receptive to it. That resistance, that kind of gut reaction of getting maybe angry, or athletes seeming like they can't handle the challenge, they're going to be more receptive if they know that you've exhibited you're in their corner. So that's, I would say, from a coaching style standpoint, there were some things, especially in that first year, that led me to just shift and change my coaching style. Interestingly, from a training standpoint, you guys actually had Nick Winkleman on this podcast already.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I will never forget, guys, when I watched his NSCA presentation on What You Say Matters.
Yeah.
If you guys are familiar with that. And I was watching that presentation. I'm like, I've never even heard of an external cue. What the heck? This is like, I feel like I've been lied to. And so this kind of whole world was opened up to me on the science of motor learning. And it was just crazy how, like, I went through like an education on strength and conditioning, and no one ever talked about motor learning. And it's something that's so critical, how we learn skills, and literally what you say can impact performance. And that's not even talked about in our, like, my undergrad degree. I was floored. So that caused me to dive down the rabbit hole of motor learning. And then, Colin, we were talking off air about agility, like change of direction and agility.
Mm-hmm.
That led to my interest in change of direction and agility. And I would say, more than anything, over the past 6 years as a strength coach, that's changed, and my philosophy on that's changed more than anything. So those are kind of, I guess, two areas that have changed a lot, and kind of the things that led to them. And obviously my colleague and boss, Brett Bartholomew, who wrote Conscious Coaching, has had a massive impact on me. And along with that kind of transition from that first year, that book showed me kind of all the ways I went astray early on. And definitely, if you're a young coach listening to this, pick it up and read it, because it'll save you a lot of headache, frustration, and kind of bang your head against the wall later in your career.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny that you bring up like motor learning in terms of, like, you know, the way that Nick approaches it. And I took a class called motor learning in college as a part of my general PE degree.
Yeah.
I went to school to be a PE teacher, and so, you know, that was part of the curriculum. But I don't remember anything being covered on how to cue people to coach movement, or let alone what is good movement versus bad movement, right? We just had a textbook, and there were pictures of squats at, you know, the top of it and the bottom of it. But, like, there was no instruction manual on how to get a kid to do that. And there was no talk of cueing at all. And that's one of those things that we kind of had to stumble along on our own to figure out. And I was lucky enough to have a really good training director when I first started at T3, kind of open my eyes to what performance training actually was. And that just made me hungry to start finding other sources of mentors. And you mentioned Brett and you mentioned Nick. When you were first getting started, did you know those guys? Did you have anybody that you could call when you were at Northwestern and say, like, hey, I might be in over my head here. Like, how do I reach these kids?
Ooh. Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't really have anybody. You know, my mentor was from Central was not, he's in Turkey currently. And so he's a little bit harder to get a hold of. He's not someone you can just kind of call up or text. So he's a performance coach in Turkey, and I'll be honest, guys, I was emulating him when I first started. That's what we do, right? We either emulate our coaches or we emulate somebody who we've perceived to be successful. And my mentor was extremely successful at Central, extremely successful. I would say reached legendary status and is still discussed today, so many years later. But I also I never got to see the early days. I never did. I saw 3 to 4 years in, where when at Northwestern for my career, 3 to 4 years in was when I could be me. That's when I could finally be me. But I couldn't be that person early on. So I had to do my own work on delving into behavior change, why people act the way they do, how to approach difficult conversations. And I'm by no means a master at any of that, or I'm still learning, but that hurtled me down this path of changing where I go. And so I just gravitated towards, not only the motor learning space, but the behavior change space. And that led me to research things like motivational interviewing, or led me down the path of going I've done all the precision nutrition certifications and training. That's where I had to go, but I did not necessarily have someone I could really turn to. Because I'll be honest, like I followed a lot of the advice from people around me saying, you better assert yourself early and often. That's the advice I was getting. And it's not really their fault. Like that's what a lot of people do. It just was too much for the athletes at the time. And so, but I was a relentless networker, James, absolutely relentless. And I still have some of those people I networked with early on are lifelong friends of mine, and Brett being one of them. And that was the genesis of our path together.
Now,
that's awesome.
You have a pretty solid background, as you're talking about in nutrition, and speaking of behavior change, and like what we do as a strength coach, to me, it seems easy to be able to communicate, improve a kid's technique to the point where he doesn't need me standing there anymore as the goal. And we talk about nutrition all the time to athletes, but it's not as simple as, hey man, I'm going to get you to feel this drill, and then you're going to be able to do it on your own. Hey man, I'm going to show you or tell you how to eat, and then you're going to do it on your own, because they don't see that change in 30 seconds like they can with a cue or some technical work. Yeah. How has that played into your career learning through your master's program in nutrition, and then onto the other certifications that you've had with nutrition? Have you found any similarities with like creating behavior change that's long lasting when it comes to nutrition?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, what that education and training has done for me is it's just made me way more aware of all the factors that go into the way we behave and the decisions that we make on a daily basis. And because you're right, nutrition is so hard because you don't see results immediately. Like if you have the right cue, man, you can change performance so instantly, and an athlete's going to be super motivated after that moment. And that goes all into this process of building buy-in. But nutrition's so much harder. You've got to shift someone's sometimes emotional response to what they put in their mouth, get them to do it over and over, and get them to believe that if they keep doing it, they're going to see results down the road, weeks, months, years down the road. So where that, I guess, from when I started like my master's, if you didn't eat a certain way, you were just lazy. That's what I thought. I'm like, if you don't eat like a bodybuilder, or if you don't like eat like me in CT, you're just lazy. And I found out that's just so not the case. So through that, it made me much more patient with athletes and clients when maybe my advice wasn't being followed, but it also made me realize I was probably giving bad advice. Okay. So when you're giving, it's so common in the nutrition world to be like, here's my 5 rules. It's only 5 things, so just follow them. But 5 things can easily be many, many things. So if someone it's the simple rule of eat 20 grams of protein per meal. Okay, well, that seems really simple, even though it's like a one thing. But first and foremost, does that person know what the protein sources are? Do they even know what the options are? Do they know how to shop for those options? If you say chicken, okay, do they know where to find the chicken in the grocery store? Do they know what cut they're looking at? Do they know what a good price is? Then if they get that chicken, do they have the requisite skills and knowledge to prep it, cook it, store it, all that kind of stuff? And so you can kind of easily see how many layers to each thing we ask people to do nutritionally. And in PN standards, that's what's called ready, willing, and able. Is somebody ready for the change? Like, are they ready to make the change emotionally? Are they willing to maybe change the things they might not be used to doing? So then maybe they're not used to shopping the perimeter of the grocery store. Maybe they're not used to asking someone at the counter for a specific cut of meat. And then do they have the skills? Are they able to do it? Do they know how to prep the chicken, cook it, all that kind of stuff? Like, do they do oven, stovetop, grill, George Foreman, all these little different decisions that can kind of get in the way and be barriers. You have to make sure that you're working through with your athletes and your clients. And so when looking at long-term change, you have to have a deep understanding of where your client is at in those types of processes. Are they ready, willing, and able? And if they're not following your advice, there's probably something in there that's snagging them up. Okay. And they're not going to tell you right away what that is, because they don't want to, no one wants to come out and say like, I don't know how to cook something, or I don't know how to shop for something, or something like that. And that's where over time you have to build the rapport and the buy-in, and make sure that they know that you are there for them. They know that you're in their corner without judgment, right? Because that's if they feel like, oh man, if Korey's going to judge me if I tell him I don't want to eat 20 grams of protein per meal because that seems just like a lot, or whatever, it seems like a lot of food, I don't want to do it. They've got to know that if they come to you with that, you're going to be like, okay, that's fine. Let's maybe focus on something else. Like, can we focus on your hydration? Can we focus on your eating patterns? Can we focus on whatever, a multitude of different things that they're going to be more receptive to. So that would just be, when I was talking with athletes, I tried to make sure that, number one, they knew I wasn't going to judge them for whatever, reason they gave me. My goal is to figure out a way around that reason and help them implement the change that they need to. And yeah, there's certain scenarios, any like coach listening to this, like, well, we don't have time for all that. Sometimes that's true, right? If I had a wrestler in my office who needed to cut 10 pounds to be able to wrestle by the end of the week, our options were pretty limited. I couldn't go, those are the times where I had to say, like, okay, man, if you want to wrestle this weekend, this is how we have to do it safely, but you have no wiggle room. Sure, there were definitely those times, but James, to kind of bring this to like the few things that I would say from a long-term behavior change, they have to be ready, willing, and able. They have to have the confidence that they can make the change you're asking them to do. And then if they can't, they have to have the safety to be able to tell you as their coach that they might need to pivot.
I think the example with the wrestling brings up like such a good point of like when the want and the need lines up and there's a short time frame, then change is going to happen, and it's going to happen pretty quick. But we kind of struggle with connecting people's want and connecting people's need, especially when it comes to nutrition, because that is so easily thrown off by a little bit of hunger in the stomach because it's 8 o'clock, and normally I eat at 8 o'clock, but I might not eat.
Right. CT, were you going to say something?
Yeah, Korey, and I was going to ask, because we end up in those scenarios a ton, being in the gym, athletes on their way out saying, hey, man, I want to do this. Hey, man, what do I want to do? That we're about to start a group, or we're finishing up with a group. Is there a conversation that can be had between the coach and the athlete there, or do you think that needs to be done at another time when there's more time to sit down and actually go into detail about it.
You mean like if someone's like getting done with training and then they might not be doing something they should do, and having that conversation in the moment, or?
Yeah, I'm thinking of, more specifically, let's say we finish up with a football group and and an athlete comes up to me as I'm getting ready to warm up the next group, and they say, "Hey, coach says I need to gain 10 pounds. What do I need to do?" Right? Because that happens countless amounts of time. Is there an actual conversation that can be had in a situation like that, or should it be text me, we'll get on the phone, we'll talk about it later?
Yeah, that's happened to me many times.
Right.
Or just like the random, hey coach, I think I need to gain some weight. What do I do? Yeah. That typically is going to, if at all possible, lead to a more in-depth conversation later. What I would always do with all my teams at the beginning of every single year is I would have a team general nutrition talk. Okay. An hour long. Here are the basics of nutrition. Here's what you can do. And if you do these things, you'll be better than 90% of all athletes. I promise you. So yeah, that was like maybe a moment where I did give them a ton of stuff, but again, always with the mindset of start somewhere, choose one thing and go. So they always had that mindset. So if at all possible, if you're a trainer, if you're a coach, try to embed an education on a consistent basis. So like CT, that could be, if you can, 5 to 10 minutes here or there, as part of like a cool down session. Leverage Instagram, leverage social media. There are many ways you can do that. Because here's the reason why I bring that up. And of course, there's still some things that will likely work for everybody. We know what those are. Like if they're not getting 20 to 30 grams of protein per meal, if they're not consuming all of the macronutrients on a regular basis, it's like there's going to be some holes there. If they're not eating regularly every like 3 or 4 hours, most athletes, those are the areas they're going to fall short on. But you kind of need to know what they're already doing, right? If you don't already know what they're doing, you have no basis for where to give advice. So if maybe they're already eating enough protein, which most like college males or male athletes aren't too far off there, but maybe their eating frequency is a major roadblock. And another thing with that is most athletes know what their main problem is. Like they mostly know. So I guess that's actually what I'll say is, if I did have that and it was just like, I got to give them something now. Like, I just feel like I've got to give them a little nugget right now to hook them. I would ask them that question. I would say, well, hey, what do you think is holding you back right now? Like, what do you think is your biggest problem? And that would at least start the conversation, because they might say something, well, I don't eat breakfast. Okay, boom, there's a starting point. Or I feel like I need to XYZ, or I just feel like I should whatever. That gives you a little inroad. And if you can correct that thing that they feel is the most, that's holding them back the most, not only are you giving them very individualized advice, but if you correct their limiting factor and the thing that's holding them back, then you're going to make a huge impact right away.
And that's so true to human nature. Is like sometimes, like most of the time we know what we're doing. That's
right.
Like, hey coach, I want to run faster. What's the biggest thing that you think is causing you to not run faster? Well, I never do any speed work. Let's start there.
Well, I never sprint.
Right. It's like they just need some confirmation that they know what they're doing is wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's tough to bring up sometimes. And I want to transition a little more back onto the training floor, Korey, because I want people to understand why you're so good at what you do now, right? Which is kind of a combination of all of it. But 6 years spent at Northwestern, right? And you said you'd gone through some ups and downs. You worked with tons of different teams, and I took a note. Cheer and dance you also worked with, which is incredible. And we just started having those athletes come in, and so that's really cool. If you'd like to talk on that a little more after this, but what was kind of the culture like while you were there at Northwestern? Like, what culture did you try to build? And also, was there a general training philosophy that you had throughout that time, or was that always changing? How did you run things over there at Northwestern?
Yeah, it's gosh, how to explain the culture. I mean, so Northwestern is an NAIA school. So if anyone's unfamiliar with that, it's like NCAA Division III is probably the most comparable, but NAIA can give scholarships. So we had football players who were full ride. And Northwestern's a small private Christian institution. It's not cheap. But being that, we also would have people who would come out on sports teams just to be a part of something. So I literally on the same team could have the star quarterback who could honestly be playing for like a Northern Iowa or a University of Sioux Falls, which is D2. They legitimately could be playing for them, but because they get a full ride, they're at Northwestern and other reasons. And on the same team, I might have someone who's literally never stepped foot in a weight room, probably shouldn't be on their JV high school team. Like seriously, that's the dynamic. And you've got the full ride kid, you've got the walk on, and all where in between. And this is not specific to Northwestern. This is everywhere, especially if it's not Power 5. Is you've got athletes who are getting just enough money not to quit.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
D3, those are D3 athletes, they just quit. If they're like, I don't really care about this anymore, I'm out. At a place like, these kind of mid-level scholarships, they'll stay. So you have a huge range of commitments. You have the super committed, you've got the, I just want to be a part of something person, and you've got the kind of what I somewhat call like the check collectors. They're like, yeah, I'm not in this anymore. So that's everywhere. That's not Northwestern, but we had some great kids, meaning like just quality individuals, but being small, private, and Christian, sports was like second, third, or fourth on the list of priorities. Like just it really was. And you had kids who were really there for sports, but that was for most of them not the reason they were there. And of course, anything that's not major Division I, like what you did, Colin, like they know they're probably not going to the next level. So again, going back to how I approach coaching or how I approach the weight room from a mentality standpoint, just like understanding that they're here for other reasons. And yes, training is important and attention to detail is important, but I would never, if at all possible, I would never sacrifice those for the relationship or they either had with myself, the sport, the school, or what they're going to do beyond that. Now, from a philosophy standpoint, training philosophy, I mean, I came up in the field in the mid to late 2000s, and I don't know if there's anyone who came up then that wasn't impacted by Mike Boyle. Like,
Mm-hmm.
my first training book I ever read was his first Functional Training for Sports, and my base training philosophy, ground-based, multi-joint, multi-dimensional movements, right? Feet's on the floor. You got to train all planes, and you got to use free weights. So that's like the basis, home base for me regarding training. And now that's so common. If you're not that way, it's like, what are you doing if you're training athletes? But back then it was a big deal. Like we were coming out of like the bodybuilding age. Like before that time, like early 2000s and maybe late 90s, there was still a lot of body part splits. There's still a lot of athletes just training like bodybuilders. So like,
which is what I had, and I've talked about it a couple times on here. That's what I had in Indiana, which was great because it made me super strong.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't do any of the movement stuff. Yeah, and I didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah, that's
good, man. Yeah,
just
it helps people understand that like that was not always just an assumed. It just wasn't. And so like those kind of classic Mike Boyle ways of thinking about training and programming still influence the way that I write programs. What's changed so much maybe is my coaching cues, kind of going back to the motor learning thing. My on the field work has changed a lot. But my structure, if you were to like look at my training structure, like the organization of training, it would look very what I would call Boyle-esque. balance of the pushes and pulls. Every double leg movement has a single leg movement. Starting off with power, Olympic lift, jump, going into like a pair set, squat, pull up, and then a pair set accessory, and then you're out. That's still like how I do things. And I think one thing that I did change, especially kind of in year 2, as I started to gain more training knowledge, is I would still do the ground-based movements, meaning, again, ground-based is feet on the ground with almost everything that you do, but I would always have like caveats, right? And particularly over, like, what I saw a lot was a lot of overhead mobility issues. That shocked me when I first started at Northwestern. I never remember athletes having a ton of overhead issues, although I might have like rose-colored glasses right on with like how we train. But I got to Northwestern, it's like people having all kinds of problem with pain overhead. They can't get their arm and overhead at all. And so I was like, wow, I've got to reevaluate. I can't have guys who dumbbell snatch, barbell snatch, even like barbell overhead pressing was a big issue with a lot of my athletes. And so I'm like, okay, I've got to somewhat find an alternative here. Like, so enter something like landmine presses. Okay, I've never done landmine press before, but it's not so particularly like a half kneeling or a tall kneeling landmine press that has a much less demand on overhead mobility. I just started to have to find all these other strategies that I could implement if athletes were having movement issues, pain, or anything like that I would have to tweak and refine, or have to kind of have them go and do before they could do the full ground-based full lift. And that to me was a big benefit to me as a coach, because now I have tools in my toolbox, and if an athlete is apprehensive, even if I don't think they should be, I now have a way to train them. So I guess was a shift in my philosophy, Colin, and that then extended to everything. Okay, a kid can't back squat. What can I do now? What options are in my toolbox? We can't Olympic lift because we have bars that are falling apart and bent and no platforms and a weight room that only accommodates 30 people. Oh, what can I do now? I have to pivot. I have to change. I have to find out and add tools to my toolbox. So that was kind of my path. But as a umbrella program at Northwestern, we didn't have like this one way of doing things. Mm-hmm. I would say we very much erred on the side of, let's not pigeonhole ourselves. Let's always remain open so we can stay adaptable to whatever our athletes need. So yes, like sometimes that made, when you have a defined philosophy, it makes sometimes things a lot easier to program for, because it's like, this is what I do and this is how we do it. But that also forced me to expand my options, like I said, and I think I was a better coach for it.
Yeah, and I think I think you give a lot more credit than maybe what I've seen in the last 8 years or so with what's generally going on out in strength and conditioning. I think there's more knowledge out there than ever for a coach that wants to adapt how they train and to adopt a Boyle-esque model. We've definitely done that here. But we still see a lot of horror stories or hear a lot of stories from kids that are, treating what we feel as prime movements in their strength and conditioning is maybe like an accessory that they skip every day at the end of their training. So, I think there's definitely a lot of room for growth, and hopefully people will continue to educate themselves. But even today, looking at the performance market in Cleveland, I think there still can be a lot done from a healthy standpoint of strength and conditioning with our athletes. But all those points you bring up about the tool belt, doesn't have a limit. Bodybuilding is a part of our tool belt. Nobody wants tiny arms. The only way you can do that is by crushing curls, right? So
Preach. Amen.
Heck yeah.
Bodybuilding is a tool belt. Powerlifting is part of the tool belt. And, I think that hopefully, part of this podcast is to open people's eyes and open athletes' eyes to the idea of there's no one wrong way of doing things unless it's the only way you do things. In that ability for you to adapt in a dynamic environment like a college where you're working with anywhere from the football to the cheer team, like you can't always use the same tool in that belt.
No, 100%. For sure.
Yeah, that's excellent stuff. And Korey, we don't want to take a ton more of your time, but there still are a few things I want to touch on. But agility and change of direction, and we can get some more of this if you pop onto Korey's YouTube channel, and we'll share that as well in the notes and whatnot when this is all going. But you do a lot of really cool things, and I said it before we were on air, but athletes who've worked with James have done some similar stuff, but I haven't seen a lot of people do some of the stuff that you guys have done as far as change of direction goes. I also haven't heard people talk about it as well as you talk about it. So, I mean, kind of quickly, would you be able to kind of sum up how you approach agility and change of direction work with your athletes? Coming from a guy who did none of it in college, like we talked about kind of our background, we were bodybuilding and we were conditioning, and those were the two things we did. And so the first time I saw athletes out in an open space on turf doing, reaction-based agility drills, that's when I saw that on your YouTube channel. I thought it was so interesting. So could you kind of talk about that a little bit? And then also I'd love to hear if you had, 30 minutes with an athlete for a speed session, what something like that would look like.
Yep, for sure. So we probably won't be able to get into like everything or like super, super deep. So I'll start off by saying that I would be remiss if I started any of this conversation without mentioning the people who have been instrumental in me going changing my approach, and that would be Sean Mishka, Tyler Yerby, and Michael Zwiefel, and they have a company called Emergence, and they're a movement education company. So any listeners who want to dive deeper there, Emergent, Sean Mishka, Michael Zwiefel, who is BBA Performance, and Tyler Yerby, so instrumental in me kind of growing there. And then of course guys like Nick, he's someone in that group as well. So where this came from and started is the fact that I was the classic weight room warrior. I was the athlete that if you walked in the weight room, you thought I was a starter because of my strength levels, my movement proficiency. And then you go to the field and I'm fifth string. And so I'm like, God, that led to a ton of frustration as an athlete. I was like, what am I'm doing everything I think I can do. I'll crush the starters in any drill you ask me to do. Whether that any agility drill or what I thought was an agility drill, I'll crush them. Take me to the football field and I'm like, it doesn't transfer. So I knew just something was like off about the way I was approaching or way I was doing things and in the way I was being trained as an athlete. But like when I started as a coach, I just did what my coach did. I just trained them the same way. And I started listening to this guy, Sean Mishka, talk about how he would take his NFL guys through pro day training, increase all their numbers, 40, pro agility, broad jump, vertical, everything would improve every single year. And then he would see them on the field and it wouldn't you couldn't tell they were any different than last year. I'm like, that sounds super familiar. That sounds like me, So I started listening to Sean more and I started diving in.
There's so many athletes in that same position who I'm sure you've seen tons of.
Why are you such a beast in the weight room and then not on the field? Why isn't this transferring? So that led me to dig into the research on agility. I went to the research. I went to people who were doing the research, like Sophia Nymphius, and I started digging into it. And what you start to find when you look at the research is that what we would classify as change of direction training, which is, as defined by the research, the changing of direction when it is pre-planned and no decisions have to be made. Okay, that's change of direction per the literature. Agility per the literature is any change of direction or velocity in response to a stimulus. Okay, there has to be a decision made at some point during the process, the activity. There's got to be some element of it where the athlete doesn't know what's going to happen next or what move to make. Okay, and then what will transpire after that. There's got to be some element there. So those are, per the research, two different things. So if I'm doing a pro agility where I know where to go first, when to turn next, and when things stop, that is not agility per the research. That's change of direction. In particular, more specifically, that would be a change of direction speed activity because the goal is time. Agility, I mean, if Colin, if you and I are doing a 1-versus-1 tag, there's no time constraint on that because my goal, if I'm the offense and if you're the defense, my goal is just not to get touched. So if I don't get touched and I make it to the other side of our box, I've achieved my task. It doesn't really matter how fast I did it, but I needed to make decisions based on what you were doing and vice versa with you to me. That's agility. Okay. And what the research has shown for years, really, was what I found out, and is continuing to show, is that the skill of doing change of direction activities and the skill of doing agility are not the same. Okay, so like, there's been research analyzing like Australian rules football, rugby, basketball, soccer, and measuring their change of direction capabilities, 5-10-5, 5-0-5, these very classic like research-based drills or tests, and then agility scenarios. And just because you're good at a change of direction speed task does not mean you're good at an agility task. And if you're good at agility, it doesn't mean you're good at change of direction. And I'm like, what? Like, this is right there in almost all the research I'm reading. So I'm like, holy crap, I've got to train my athletes differently. Like, we can't just do a 6-week block of X drill, L drill, pro agility, W drill, C drill, whatever letter drill with cones, and expect that they're going to be a higher performer on the field. So right there, I'm like, I've got to do more of the true agility end of the spectrum, or else my athletes aren't getting better at the decision-making end of it. Like Nick Winkelman years ago, I have this in my presentation because I screenshot it and saved it because I'm like, yes, he had a tweet based, this is kind of his baby, his expert. He's an expert in this area where he said, if you want athletes to make better decisions, they need to make decisions. So it has to be an element of your training, put very simply. And I have a whole presentation on this that I could go into, but like, I would encourage anybody to start to dive into the research on this topic, follow the guys at Emergence, follow what Nick's been doing. And there's a number of textbooks and resources out there on this. And I'm willing to share anything that I've got. But if you guys go to my YouTube channel, which I don't know, you guys can maybe put that in the show notes or something. I've got a lot of what I've done. And at the end of the day, what I did was I put athletes in scenarios to make decisions. And I took very like small snippets of the game, because it's all football, like everything up there is football. I would take like very small sections or snippets of a game or a play, and I would just like focus on that. What decisions need to be made, what movements are necessary, or what's the goal of the activity. And I would start very simply, and over the course of 6 to 8 weeks, we'd get more complex. We would have the decisions to be made to be more complex. We'd add more people into the drills, all that kind of stuff. But that, me looking at the research and just like it pretty clearly showing that just because you're good at change of direction activities does not mean you're good at agility, and vice versa. Just informed the way that I approached my training. And luckily I had the freedom to do that. Like, I had no coaches telling me I had to train a certain way. And so I had the total freedom and autonomy to do that. I'm very grateful for that. So that's kind of, amazingly, that's the short version.
Yeah, Yeah, and I think that's
It's
a really important thing for young athletes to understand, because I mean, I get a lot of sessions and a lot of athletes that come to me specifically saying, I want a better 40, I want a better pro agility. And I said, okay, that's great. I will help you with that, but do you want to be a better football player too? And,
Boom.
and then
Yes.
that opens the door to that conversation. What do you mean? And then we can talk about it, and we can talk about how we're just memorizing patterns. We're memorizing steps. That's great, but monkeys can do that. But football players need to be able to react. And kids won't until they understand it, really get away from their emphasis on the pro agility. And it's, again, memorizing stuff. You need to do extra work on your own. I don't want to spend a whole hour doing that.
It's like cramming and memorizing for a multiple choice test. Okay, I can do that and I'll get an A. I didn't learn a dang thing.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to go to the real world and apply anything.
Yeah.
Now, does there still need to be some like learning of the content and memorization? A little bit, yeah. But we all know that people who are amazing test takers, and that's what the pro agility is, it's the test. And if all they do is study for the test, they'll ace the test, but the greater learning and application and being thrust into the real world and being able to apply the knowledge, they may not have. And that's just very similar to being like a monster at the change of direction activities, but maybe not in these chaotic game-like scenarios where they've got to make decisions.
Yeah. And
So that's a great one, James.
In a football game, nobody's ever took back a tackle a kid made because when he made a cut, he put his hand down on a line. Like, oh, you can do that in the pro agility, but like nobody's going to take stats away from you if that happens in a game. And,
Right.
those are the annoying things that I coach, and I have to coach because that's what they're paying me to do. But as long as they can get a little bit out of that from a sense of like understanding, like when this is over, we're playing football and we're going to change up what we're doing drill wise. And they're cool with that.
And if I could give some advice to people who are like, oh crap, all I do is this, what Korey's talking about is change of direction, is just make sure you're doing both.
Yeah.
Don't throw everything out the window. Just make sure you're doing both. Start your session. So Colin, to your question, the 30 minutes, start your session maybe with the more cone drill based closed stuff. But you've got to get to the decision making element. I call it if you worried about kind of tissue tolerance, and if you're worried about kind of these very physical capacity elements of change of direction, yeah, sure, you've got to maybe address those. But that's like improving the car. If we use a car analogy, that's improving the car. But I can be, like me personally, I can be in the most souped up car known to man. It's worthless because I'm a terrible driver. I will take a NASCAR driver in a crappy car over me in a really souped up car any day. That NASCAR driver is going to kick my butt. So we want to improve the driver with scenarios and things we do that make them make decisions and make mistakes and then adjust and then go back to it. What are all the different ways they can maybe solve a specific movement problem? You've got to improve both. Okay. So I would say to any coach, like, just make sure that you're doing at least some element. And I would say you can do it before you really feel like they're ready, because at the end of and this is why I always went back to it, Northwestern. When we're in January, February, they're going to play spring ball in March. They're going to play their sport in a very short amount of time. So I better make sure they're ready for that. Yeah. So that would be, I guess, Colin, to kind of wrap this up, where I would go with the 30 minutes. Like, don't necessarily feel like you've got to change everything wholesale. Just start to add in the decision-making elements, and people can kind of go to my YouTube to get ideas. I would recommend not just copy and pasting it, but just look at what I'm asking my athletes to do. Kind of notice how I change things drill to drill, and then make sure you use that to fit your coaching style, your athletes, your space that you're working with. And your athletes will be better for it.
Yeah, man. Awesome stuff. I mean, again, I haven't heard somebody talk about it like that since the last time I heard you talk about it like that. So really appreciate diving into it.
Yeah.
You know, and I hope people go back and listen to that over and over again and you know, kind of do some self-reflection and see what they're doing as a coach and what, you know, our athletes are doing as athletes when it comes to that. But, you know, change your direction, agility, the differences we covered, talked about a lot of nutrition. We talked about obviously like how to get big arms. You know, we've been through a lot of stuff, covered a lot of stuff here. What do you think we're missing as coaches, Korey, to kind of wrap up here in the strength and conditioning world?
Yeah. Well, I've got to talk about, you know, the core of art of coaching. Like our base philosophy is that the quality of your coaching and the effectiveness of your coaching comes down to your ability to communicate. Like that's the core belief of what we have. Like our core mission is to be the premier guide for coaches and educators and leaders on communication. And I kind of told you guys about my failures about that early in my career. So if you're a coach and you're having issues with buy-in, your athletes aren't following your advice, your athletes aren't giving the effort that you want, parents aren't listening to you, coaches don't listen to you, they want their athletes to train a certain way and you know that's not the way to go, but they are unwilling to change to your way of thinking. You can't convince your administrators, your athletic directors to give you funding or a new facility. Like all of these things rest on your ability to communicate, every single one. And, you know, we, unfortunately in strength and conditioning, we've had a recent situation, you know, with like the University of Iowa where someone, you know, they didn't know, like a coach didn't know how he was coming across for so long, and athletes, it wore on them, you know. And so I would say what strength coaches, they need to start learning more about as soon as possible, and there's no time that's too early, is communication and behavior change and all the different factors that go into that, and then how to influence them. Because it all comes back to, like, if you have the most beautiful mesocycle, macrocycle, 4-year quadrennial plan, so scientifically laid out, and then your athletes don't do it the way that they should do it with the effort and focus that they need to, it doesn't really matter. Like, it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you have we're in week 4 of my amazing cycle, right, of training, but half my team went out drinking the night before. Oh crap. It's just like, okay, how do I adjust and how do I pivot in those moments? Or did I communicate effectively? Like, going out drinking probably wasn't the best thing to do. So that's where the communication aspect, we believe so strongly in it. And our goal is to bring that education to coaches, help them become more effective. And then at the end of the day, like, if you do that, like, we're helping coaches be more effective. And we know that strength and conditioning coaches, by and large, and leaders, they're so giving, and they want the best for their athletes, by and large, that will just help make everyone, our athletes better, the industry better, which is really is definitely a good thing. So that's what I guess I would say strength and conditioning is missing at this time.
That's perfect, man. Where can we find you for people who want to hear more?
Yeah, all social media outlets, Korey Van Wyk. You'll find me. Instagram, Art of Coaching, AO Coaching. And then anyone who wants to follow up can email me, Korey@artofcoaching.com.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome stuff, man. James,
yeah,
anything before we run?
You just mentioned about, like, communicating, like, it doesn't just make you a better coach, like, it'll make you better at whatever job you might have 5 years from now.
Right.
And if you don't want to admit that we can all grow at this, like, it's going to be a lot harder no matter what you're doing. And, you know, I'd rather have young coaches and look at that and hear, like, well, like, you know, I might as well learn this lesson now and start, you know, always be learning about coaching, communication, exercise than, you know, do 1 year of strength and conditioning and say that like, oh, you know, it's just not my job. It's not the field cut out for me.
Right.
You know, like, oh,
Yeah.
this
And
school wasn't
James,
my type of coaching.
yeah. James, I'll take it one step further. There's no aspect of life that doesn't get better if you become a better communicator.
100%.
Like my wife and I, in a matter of days, and by the time of this releases, it will be a reality.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A massive life shift that will challenge our communication and our ability as a couple to communicate. There's no aspect of life that doesn't get better if you become a better communicator. And so that's why Brett and I feel like this extends to any field and any profession and anybody who deals with people, not just strength coaches. Because if you become a better communicator, there's no facet of life that will not improve. So that's a great point to every profession, but I'll take it to all of the rest, anything in your life. So.
Absolutely, man. Well, Korey, thank you so much. It's been awesome getting to meet you and chat
Absolutely.
for the last hour. You know, there's definitely a lot more here, and we'd love to have you on again and maybe talk a little bit more about the art of coaching and how the online space is something that, you know, you're diving into now. I'd love to hear more about that. So thanks again. It was awesome. Hopefully we'll do this again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.